Higher energy costs are driving up inflation, and that's putting pressure on Asian currencies against the strong dollar. Weakened currencies could only make inflation worse by lifting the cost of imports. It could also weigh on government finances as they increase subsidies and support measures. Now, at the center of all this is maritime risk, and that's boiling back down to the Strait of Hormuz. So to give us insights on this, we have Michael Walls, Managing Director, Cargo, Marine and Logistics at Marsh Asia. Michael, thanks for coming down. So it's really back down to the passage of ships in the Strait of Hormuz and the geopolitical landscape. But how much of this blockade is, due to the safety and other factors such as insurance and costs?
I mean, the majority of it is all down to safety. I mean, I think if you look at before the war, you had 150 ships going through a day. That dried up to almost nothing. We're starting to see a few more ships go through now under special circumstances. Insurance is available. It is not the reason that people aren't going. Obviously, the cost of that insurance is higher, particularly to go through the strait. And it's been priced for the risk, but it's really more down to crew safety, safety of the assets, and reputational risk, I think.
You mentioned that we're seeing some ships pass through now, not as much, of course, as what it was before. What are the conditions from this? Like, who's getting to pass?
Well, for the majority of the ships are Iranian and or the sort of what's called the dark fleet, so ships that were doing that trade of Iranian oil anyway. The sort of increase in ships tends to be, from what we can see, more Chinese and Indian. And as has been reported, there seems to be now a sort of more semi-official clearance system that's been set up by the IRGC to allow ships that they deem to be not aligned to hostile states to go through under certain circumstances and exchange of information. They're given a clearance code, apparently, and they're allowed to transit. But that's still a handful compared to the trade that was happening last month.
Do you think we'll see more ships pass through under those agreements with Iran?
I suspect so. I think one of the macro factors that's driving all this, obviously, is energy security, as you said, particularly for Asia. So national interests will start to bear as countries look at their own national fuel reserves and energy reserves. So I would suspect so, yes.
Today we also heard from U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. He said that the U.S. insurance program meant to boost shipping through the Strait of Hormuz will begin soon. But how effective will that be? Well, first of all, what would that look like? And how effective will it be when, like I said, crew safety is still at risk?
Yeah, I mean, the announcement that came, I think it was 3 weeks ago now. And to be frank, there's still quite scarce detail on exactly what that looks like and how it's going to be implemented. Chubb was nominated as the insurer to front that programme, but beyond that, no one seems to have very much detail on how it's going to be implemented yet.
So it all boils down to kind of the military side.
I think that sort of, physical safety and freedom of navigation. And, there's the other issue, which is obviously the question of mines in the water. There's been reported that there are some. The US said they destroyed all the mine layers, but it's now, because the question is out there, that again, in most people's minds, adds to the risk and the uncertainty, because mines, once they're in the water, can't really be controlled.
And the U.S. has, at least a few weeks ago, proposed escorting some ships through the Strait of Hormuz. Then they said maybe other countries can do it, and no one seems to want to do that. So is that an option now?
I mean, I can't speculate too much onto a military strategy in this point, but I think most people are saying that would increase the risk of escalation to a point from which there's been no coming back. And so I think at the moment, everyone's trying to find other options.
Yeah, and when we talk about the Strait of Hormuz, of course, oil is big. There are a lot of other cargoes as well that pass through. How has that affected the global flow of goods aside from energy? And could you just put it in perspective to us and compare this to what we saw during the pandemic?
So, I mean, there are about 200 oil tankers. I mean, actually, there are only about 20 LNG tankers, so far fewer, but actually the proportion of the free, what's called spot trading LNG fleet, is actually much bigger. So the LNG potentially is a bigger risk on the energy side than the oil if this goes on for a long time. But there are about 100 container ships, so we've seen container ships start to offload their boxes either back onto shore or onto other smaller container ships. Maersk has just issued a customer release to say that they are increasing their customer surcharge based on fuel emergency. And the availability of fuel for vessels is something now that everyone is also discussing, because it's going to run out at some point, and that's going to constrain the ability of vessels to trade freely, and it's going to probably bottleneck ships to only be able to go between certain major ports, potentially.
Is this a temporary squeeze, or do you see this affecting the more longer-term flow of goods and how supply chains operate?
I think it does depend slightly how much longer this goes on for. Shipping and beyond that, the wider logistics industry is very adaptable. And there are resources everywhere. Resiliency has been built in. So I don't think it's necessarily going to fundamentally change the entire scope of how goods are moved around the world. But again, it really does depend if we're talking about weeks or months.
Yeah. Before this, the Gulf was seen as a rather safe place. I mean, you think of Dubai, Abu Dhabi, and Qatar and all that. After this war, do you expect insurances to increase for that part of the world in particular?
Well, the marine insurance industry is still open and wanting to enable trade for the vessels. Obviously, pricing will probably take some time to tail off again. Once if and hopefully soon the situation resolves itself, there will be a sort of cooling off period, I think, in pricing. And then, obviously, it's not just the ships. We're talking about, there's the land infrastructure as well. So my colleagues on the political violence side will be facing something similar, looking at making sure that clients have protection and making sure that the market is providing insurance at a reasonable cost.
And how much risk do you think ship owners and others are willing to take after all this?
Yeah, I mean, the dynamics are, if you just look at the pure economics, the amount that these vessels can now charge for providing their ship has gone up a lot. So there's that on the one hand, the cost of insurance within that, but then you've got to measure that against the safety of the crew, and ultimately the master of the ship has the final say on whether a ship goes or not. But obviously there's a bigger sort of economic play in sort of whether these ships go through. And again, partly that it seems now that's being controlled by the Iranians as to who's allowed to go and who's not.
Yeah. You mentioned mines earlier and what has to be cleared, in the waters after we see an end to the war. How much longer do you think that will take after we see an end before clear passage?
And what I've read, is that it would take at least several weeks to fully verify and sweep the area from mines. Again, I've not seen anyone guarantee that there are mines there, but that's the problem with mines is once if you think they're there, then that's almost as effective as a deterrent.
Yes, a lot of things still need to happen before we see free-flowing ships there. Michael, I appreciate it. Michael Walsh there, Managing Director, Cargo, Marine and Logistics at Marsh Asia.